Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Giving Tuesday. This webinar is co-hosted by CAF and Wings. Charities Aid Foundation's Global Alliance is a leading international network of independent and locally led organizations working at the forefront of philanthropy and civil society. They work together to build a generosity movement locally and globally, motivating society to give ever more effectively and helping to transform lives and communities around the world. Wings is a global network of philanthropy developers in 40 countries around the world whose purpose is to strengthen, promote, and provide leadership on the development of philanthropy. We have with us today Asha Curran and Michael Mapstone, and I will pass the reins off to Michael, who is our moderator today. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for putting that terrible photo of me up on the screen. Asha, hi, how are you?
I'm well. I like the photo.
No, it's awful. Anyway, I will complain to people here later about that one. Asha, well, Wings, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this webinar. And Asha, it's great to be in contact with you, although I assume you're far across the pond in New York City at the moment.
I am in New York at the moment, kind of miraculously, since I'm often not, but last week I was in Italy with our whole community of country leaders, so we missed having you there, but it was nice to see your colleagues.
Wonderful. That sounds lovely. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about Giving Tuesday. I've got a few questions, but then I'm going to leave most of the talking to you, if that's okay. I suppose we're going to start off with Giving Tuesday. How did it all start?
So it started 8 years ago now, which is remarkable. It seems like just yesterday to me, although I was on a call the other day with somebody who was clearly very, very young, much younger than me, and said, oh, Giving Tuesday's been on my radar since college. for some people, it's officially becoming a tradition and seems like something they can reach far back in their memories for. But for us, it seems like just yesterday. So in 2012, in the summer of 2012, our current CEO was not then yet our CEO, Henry Timms, thought of the idea and came in one day and he told it to me and I thought it was great. And we had a couple of decisions to make. We both work at the 92nd Street Y, which is a cultural and community center on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And it was quite an unusual idea for this place because the Y does many amazing things. It runs a center for senior citizens and a nursery school, and it has jazz concerts and celebrity lectures and so forth, a million different things. But starting, global movements is certainly not one of those things. So we thought we wanted to pursue this idea, and we had a couple of important decisions to make. First thing, and the first two decisions we made turned out to be really elemental for what the movement ultimately grew to be. And at the time, they were fairly difficult decisions as well. So one was to launch Giving Tuesday that year. And anyone who works in a sort of big, old, lumbering nonprofit knows that normally what would happen is that you would think of an idea in the summer of 2012 and expect to see it come to light in the fall of 2013 after endless committee meetings and so forth. But we decided we really wanted to get it out into the world, and rather than run it through that kind of traditional process, learn from it actually being out there. So we launched it in something like 60 or 80 days, which was tremendously fun, kind of nerve-wracking, a lot of work, and really sort of pounding the pavement grassroots work. We had very little resource then. We called up our colleagues and friends at the United Nations Foundation. We'd worked very closely with them on other projects in the past. They loved the idea, and they offered to run communications for Giving Tuesday, which they did for the first 3 years, or perhaps 4 years. And the second decision we made was to what we call now unbrand Giving Tuesday, which means that, again, anybody who works at a nonprofit, big, small, medium, knows that branding is traditionally very, very important. Sometimes, unfortunately, it becomes even more important than our mission. And I think that's where it becomes a problem. So like all nonprofits, the Y is always concerned about sort of where its logo is going and the kind of credit it gets for its work. But we really felt like this was kind of in the very nascent days of Twitter. A lot of people didn't even know what a hashtag was, but we really had this sort of instinct that in this sort of world of social media, we really pictured this in the beginning as a very digitally driven movement. People were not going to be responding to traditional branding tactics, to traditional ideas of how an organization, an institution, or a corporation owns an idea. And we really wanted Giving Tuesday to be something that anyone and everyone could co-own and co-build and co-create with us. So that decision to leave the 92Y branding off of it was, a bit controversial internally at the time, but was 100% the right decision, because now it is genuinely a globally co-created movement.
That's amazing. It sounds like some real brave decisions being made right at the beginning there, especially in terms of relinquishing the brand, and I suppose that's the first step in creating this movement that's Giving Tuesday.
Yeah, I think we I think the way we framed it to ourselves was, well, if it's a success, we were right about the branding, and if it's a failure, great that our name wasn't on it in the first place.
Very clever.
Yeah.
Underpinning Giving Tuesday, kind of philanthropy and compassion, those are some of the big key themes that we see coming out. How did you kind of come to that? And what's the focus on communities and the part they play in kind of making decisions for themselves? That's that bottom-up approach. Where did that thinking come from?
Well, so, the word philanthropy is so interesting to me. I've actually stopped using it, broadly speaking, in connection with Giving Tuesday, because it evokes something that it doesn't actually mean, right? The word philanthropy means love of humanity. It's derived from those words. And what it's come to mean in kind of popular understanding is very, very wealthy people wire transferring very, very large amounts of money to other things, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not all that philanthropy is, and that's not all that it means. And it can be an alienating word in the sense that a normal person who has something to give, who has a generous behavior to display, is very unlikely to think of themselves as a philanthropist. So in the beginning, we sort of had the feeling like anybody can be a philanthropist, right? That was sort of our internal working tagline. And now we think of it more as givers, right, than philanthropists, because I think that there's still so much that is fraught about that word. But in its true meaning, in the love of humanity meeting, that was very much what Giving Tuesday was about in the beginning. And the idea was, Giving Tuesday was framed more narrowly than it is now, which I think worked for those beginning years, because I think it needed to be really crisp so that people really understood what it was. And the way that we framed it then was, there's Black Friday and there's Cyber Monday here in the US. And remember, then we didn't even know it was going to go global. And then there's a day to get back, right? So 2 days of consumption, 2 days that are great for the retail sector, followed by a day that's both good for the social sector and also good for our souls, right? That after these kind of days of gluttony, that we have a day that really speaks to sort of our better angels and the better part of ourselves. So that was really our idea in the beginning. And I think we were very organizationally focused, where I think we've really broadened that lens quite a lot now. The community thing which you ask about is a little bit different, because it didn't come from us. It was one of the many, many amazing things about Giving Tuesday that came completely organically from the movement itself. So when we were first thinking of tools and resources that we could create, people we could reach out to, we were really thinking about sort of the nonprofit sector. We were thinking about engaging businesses in doing something for a cause. We were thinking about, how one engages schools and families and houses of worship. And then right away, that first year, Giving Tuesday did go hyperlocal. And the very first city to organize around it was Baltimore, Maryland, and they had a tremendously successful Giving Tuesday. And what they did was so surprising and delightful to us, because it was not just about nonprofits, and it wasn't just about fundraising. It was about taking pride in the place that you live and the people you live with, in taking responsibility for the things that community needs to thrive, taking responsibility for building community and exhibiting acts of kindness and generosity toward one another. That campaign, linked together the mayor's office and the local businesses and the local nonprofits and actual people. And it raised a lot of money, but I think it was also hugely profound and moving for the citizens of Baltimore to be kind of engaged and united together in something so positive and so optimistic and so rooted in, in hope, in the sort of positive impact that we each can make. And then we just saw that community idea just being replicated over and over and over again. But while I wish we could claim that was, strategic from the center of our team, it really wasn't. It was one of those things that we saw happening and we said, this is amazing, and we're going to do everything we can to support it.
That's brilliant. That's great. And I think that's one of the things that we at CAF really love about Giving Tuesday. It's this idea, you talked about philanthropy, and you can go very philosophical about that, but ultimately it's about people giving and being engaged in their communities, in society, making decisions they want to make. It's very empowering and about agency. And I think Giving Tuesday really helps spread that message and let people take it where they want to go, and that's incredible. And I suppose a lot of people listening are in similar organisations like CAF, where we work to we work to support the development of philanthropy and strengthen civil society and support that connection of individuals and social issues. Do you see Giving Tuesday playing a big role in supporting this groundwork of building civil society, and especially around domestic, public giving and public engagement? Is that a big role you see Giving Tuesday playing?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to clarify that I don't mean that in the sense of Giving Tuesday influencing policy, because I think it is fairly removed from that sphere. But I do think that in general, and I especially see this as more countries around the world become engaged, and countries where civil society is in crisis. Not that it's not in crisis here in the U.S., but I think in some places it's really in acute crisis. And we would, I think, not have expected necessarily that Giving Tuesday would take hold in places like that it almost seemed like perhaps it was more of a luxury, right? That oh yes, I have sort of a stable civil societal groundwork, and so I'm going to sort of build this movement on top of it, which was not actually what happened at all. And I think that's because giving is a fundamental metric of civic participation. And when you have generous behaviors unifying a community, then all kinds of other pro-social behaviors can stem from that and can be built on top of that. So if you have places, we have places in our movement like Puerto Rico, Somalia, Venezuela, Liberia, Tanzania, South Africa. In these places, Giving Tuesday is something that is really trying to strengthen communities from the ground up. And that right there, even before you bring NGOs into it, is building a stronger civil society.
No, I completely agree. Completely. What surprised you about Giving Tuesday to date? What are the big things that made you sit up and go, "Oh, we didn't expect that"?
All the good things. So the global thing, bears mentioning for absolutely. So the Giving Tuesday spread by year 2 to you guys, UK and Canada, and I think that was like wonderful. We were kind of amazed and delighted, but I think it wasn't really shocking, right? I think those are places where an idea like this can export fairly easily. But then as more and more countries started to join, we really realized that this was something that really could cross borders in the most extraordinary way. And what that meant to me was something much, much more profound than just, oh, this idea is scaling. It was actually a kind of validation of the idea that generosity is a universal human value, and that there's literally not a single person on earth who couldn't, if they choose to, take part in a generosity movement. There's no philosophy that precludes that, no religion, no ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the days that people celebrate, the rituals that people have around certain days around the world, there's really not a universal one, right? The whole world doesn't even celebrate New Year's at the same time. And so we thought in the beginning that the first global day was very likely to be Cyber Monday. And we thought that was, a little sad that the first global day, the first day that could unite everybody in the same activity would be around shopping. Is sort of a uniquely 21st century idea, and one that could only come from the US. But over the course of the years, it actually seems like Giving Tuesday is outpacing Cyber Monday globally. And so that speaks to something much more hopeful, I think, as far as I'm concerned. So we're now at 56 countries. I think we anticipate getting to 100 countries within the next few years, but my goal is really deeper impact and greater public awareness and broader types of participation in those countries rather than just counting the number of countries. So the global piece for sure, the hyperlocality for sure, the fact that what we saw in Baltimore that first year now numbers over 150 campaigns here in the U.S. and many that we don't even know about, that we kind of find out via Google alerts after Giving Tuesday itself, and also that idea, these local communities engaging around Giving Tuesday, is also happening in other places. So there's places in Russia, communities in Brazil, Spain, right, on and on, sort of just doing the same thing that we see communities doing here in the U.S. And then I think the last one I'll mention that has been surprising in just a really rewarding way is this idea of Giving Tuesday yielding the 21st century social sector leader, right? So I think, when you look at the challenges that the sector faces, leadership is really near the top of that list in a bunch of different ways. First of all, we tend to compensate social sector workers so poorly that in places where they have the option of making more money, we're going to be losing a lot of the best and brightest young people to other sectors. I think that's due to a lot of things, a lot of scarcity mindset in the sector, but it really affects the leadership pipeline. And then I think that we also, within the sector, tend to think of leadership in a really old school model. So the kind of nonprofit CEO that we would have looked to hire, or nonprofit leader, decades ago, we're still often looking for those same characteristics. And the characteristics of Giving Tuesday leaders tend to be very different and very, very similar to one another. And that's something that we couldn't have planned and something that we could only have observed as that pool, that network, this interconnected community of leaders grew all over the world. We started realizing these people really do share some common leadership and personality characteristics, and they're not your typical ones. So they tend to be entrepreneurial. They tend to be really impatient for change. They get very bored with the sort of normal, slow, bureaucratic nonprofit practices. They tend to think in cross-sector ways and in collaborative ways. The Giving Tuesday network of leaders exists to support each other. If they hit on an idea that works, they want to see it replicated. Whereas often that mindset is, if I hit on a best practice or something that really works, I'm going to keep it to myself so that only I can benefit from it, rather than sharing it, rather than wanting to see other people succeed from that idea. So I think this community of leaders is really upending the whole idea of what a successful social sector leader is, what kind of leader is going to make this sector globally vibrant and thriving and sustainable through the next generation. And I think we're willing to kind of place some big bets on our leaders and leaders like them. And I think one thing that we want to do much more of within the Giving Tuesday ecosystem is be able to support those leaders, not just as representatives of their Giving Tuesday campaigns, but as individual leaders.
Yeah, we've spoken about that in the past, and I think that's what's really exciting, how Giving Tuesday is, not only creating this movement of giving and engagement, but it's bringing together these key individuals that have that shared mindset and vision and passion all together. And I think that's something that, Giving Tuesday is an incredibly innovative initiative and movement. It'll be really interesting to hear from you what innovation you've seen that's come out of the Giving Tuesday movement. How has innovation spurred more innovation?
So I think in the beginning, we really wanted Giving Tuesday, this was part of our initial hope for it, our initial strategy, was that it would, by sort of opening up the giving season, because remember, initially we really were looking at it through a U.S. lens, and in the U.S., December 31st is the biggest day of giving of the year, and it tends to be a very transactional one, right? So you give on December 31st because it's the last day of the year, and you need to give that day to get your tax benefit for that year, and so you pick out a few nonprofits and you write a few checks, whatever feels financially significant. It's sort of extremely like the opposite of Giving Tuesday in the sense of being something that nobody really talks about, something that nobody really cares that much about or gives that much thought to. It's literally the last thing you think of on any given calendar year is what you're going to do with your philanthropy. So we really wanted to draw that back to give several weeks to kind of open the giving season with Giving Tuesday, and then have organizations have that whole time to play with, right? So encouraging innovation in the sense that, okay, now the giving, you know, the campaign for this end of year is now kind of has these bookmarks. What new things can you try? What new experiments, what new collaborations, what new risks can you take? And we really saw people doing so much with that in the very first year, organizations taking the logo and creating, you know, their own really humorous, really interesting, really funny hashtags out of them and campaigns out of them, doing really, really meaningful things. And again, both online and offline, and online in really interesting ways. You know, one story that I love from the first year was the Michael J. Fox Foundation was using the Unselfie campaign by asking people in their world, not just necessarily donors, but people who cared about that cause, which is Parkinson's research, to upload pictures of the loved one on whose behalf they were giving on Giving Tuesday. And so what you saw was this campaign of like really old-timey sepia-toned photos of loved ones with notes about, you know, I'm donating on behalf of my father or my aunt or my cousin or my brother, and really meaningful. So I think one innovation was the things that organizations did with it, but another innovation was simply bringing giving into the public sphere as an accepted topic of conversation. Because I remember thinking that first year, I know so many of these people who are posting on Facebook or on Twitter, and yet I had no idea what they care about. I had no idea what they choose to give to or how they choose to express their generosity. And it's so interesting to think that you can know someone well and not know something that fundamental about them. And usually the fact that they do care about something means that they have a reason for caring about something. And so that caring is connected to a story. And that story is connected to who they are, and how you build empathy with them and how you build a relationship with them. So many kind of levels of meaning there. Over the course of the years, one thing I've been concerned about with Giving Tuesday is that more people will say, you know, in the beginning, I mean, at least this is my interpretation of what they're saying. In the beginning, Giving Tuesday was kind of a license to innovate, but over the past few years, it's felt like a pressure to innovate. Like, we did this great thing last year. It was successful. Oh my God, now what do we do this year? And I never want people to feel like Giving Tuesday is putting a ton of pressure on them. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be celebratory. It's supposed to be about experimenting with new ideas. And so we always say, if you did something last year and it worked, just do it again. You know, it's still going to be new to the eyes of many, many, many other people. The thing that some organizations have done with it in recent years is actually to sort of flip the script on it, and instead of asking for anything, they'll decide to do completely different things. Like some organizations will call everyone and just say, thank you for being part of our world. And the interesting thing is that organizations that do that also actually tend to raise money, because people are very moved by the fact that they're not being asked. And then a couple of organizations last year, and I thought this was a wonderful innovation as well, decided to fundraise for other organizations. So I think part of this idea of like, we exist in the sector in this sort of very siloed way, where we're worried about our fundraising, and we're worried about our logo, and we're worried about our credit, and kind of fourth is we're worried about meeting our mission. It's encouraging people to think about mission first and branding last, and that encourages people to reach out beyond their walls to people who are mission aligned, or sometimes who are not mission aligned, to see what they can do together.
Yeah, I think that's incredible, especially that piece you were saying, you know, where people start talking about their giving. I mean, it's very interesting to hear you saying, you know, even in the US, where we always think that people are very vocal and open about their philanthropy, though Giving Tuesday's kind of grown that culture. That's incredible, because we see it in many countries where we work, where, you know, philanthropy is very private and it's not really spoken about. But, you know, we've been able to utilize Giving Tuesday as a way to get people talking about their giving, and just how, you know, how incredible that is, and how that then adds to the movement and adds to the growth of giving. I think is incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it really is a common theme in a lot of other countries. And when we were at our global summit a couple weeks ago, meeting of all of our country leaders, people were saying, oh, in my country, it's not like the U.S. where people love to brag about their giving. And I was thinking a lot about that because it's actually not something I see except from the media covering big dollar giving, right? So-and-so gave $500 million to such and such research university. That certainly, could be conceived as kind of the subject of a lot of bragging. But I don't, or at least I didn't before Giving Tuesday, see a whole lot of regular people sharing about their regular dollar giving, right? Or their non-monetary giving. Because there is, even in the US, a sort of sense that it's less noble to talk about your giving or share about your giving. And there, in almost every religious tradition, there is a sort of admonishment about keeping your giving private, right? The right hand shouldn't know what the left hand is giving, right? Or there's a famous Jewish philosopher, Maimonides, who talks about the noblest form of giving being that which no one knows about. And I think, these sayings were not created at times when social media existed. And I think now you can really make the argument that sharing about your giving prompts others to give. In fact, there's plenty of data on the fact that that's the case. And since that's the case, you could make the argument that it is the ethical thing to do to share about your giving. So I think the Giving Tuesday theme in a lot of these countries is exactly that. Like, let's talk about giving. Let's talk about how we choose to express generosity. And then let's talk about how we choose to express generosity every day in everything we do, in every interaction we have, not just in checks that we write or donate buttons that we click on. In Russia, there's a great campaign called Confession Week. I believe this will be their third year doing it, because in Russia, there is actually quite robust giving to NGOs, but people really don't talk about it. And so they do this social media campaign, which is so brilliant and so Giving Tuesday, because it's lighthearted, right? It's not shaming people or guilting people into talking about their giving. It's funny, and so people hold a sign saying essentially, "I confess I gave to XYZ."
Yeah, no, it's a great campaign. You briefly touched on data there, and we've seen that recently Giving Tuesday set up the Giving Tuesday Data Collaborative, which if I'm right, it's with a bunch of data partners. It's cross-sectorial. It's got giving platforms, social media, and non-profits as well. What's the purpose of it, and where do you see that going?
So the story of how the Data Collaborative came about is kind of funny, because we certainly did not set out in the beginning to create a data collaborative. The data, what we called for a couple of years the data project, was simply a math equation, essentially. In the very beginning of Giving Tuesday, after the day itself, we would get calls from the press saying how much was donated, on Giving Tuesday. As someone who actually was relatively new to the sector, I worked here at the Y. I ran cultural programs. I never did anything that was actually considered, being in a philanthropic career. So my learning curve was very, very steep, and I was utterly shocked at how poor the state of data was. The fact that it was so hard for me to get to a number, to even count online giving in a 24-hour period was shockingly difficult, because money is donated through dozens and dozens and dozens of different platforms. Money donated offline is almost out of the question to be able to count, because it all rolls up into tax forms that are not broken down by day. So I realized quickly that all we could count was online giving. So this started out as reaching out to platforms, giving platforms, payment processors, just to say, would you give us the number of dollars that you saw donated online on your platform yesterday in this 24-hour period? And we started getting that. And that was what it was for a couple of years. It was just a way to arrive at a mere approximation of even a fraction of what was actually donated on the day. And those numbers increased so exponentially. It was really remarkable. But in the last few years, we realized, and a lot of this work has been led by my colleague, Woodrow Rosenbaum, that the data that we were able to get from our partners was much, much richer than just a dollar amount. That in that transactional data, going back from before Giving Tuesday was even created and involving transactional data on every day of the year, not just Giving Tuesday, what we could see in those data sets is changes in giving behavior, changes in levers and drivers of giving, what those trends are like now, because there are so many people doing really interesting data work in the sector, and I want us all to be collaborating as much as we possibly can. But what we don't have a clear understanding of is, what does drive generosity now? And I think Giving Tuesday is a prism through which we can answer some of that question. Again, not just about Giving Tuesday, but in general. And if we know that, we will be able to use that information to drive more giving, and not just in monetary forms, but knowing what moves people, what makes people share, what prompts people to give in various ways, right? That information is all only for the good. So every other industry already does this. It's not a radical idea, right? You can have almost every sliver of the retail industry, pick a thing, plastic photo frames, pools their collective data. I don't actually know if photo frame industry does that. I just happen to be looking at a photo frame right now. And then they mine that data for information that's going to benefit everybody in the photo frame industry. And it makes all the sense in the world, but our sector is far, far behind in putting anything like that together. And I think Giving Tuesday is well positioned to do it because we are not ourselves a platform. We don't process a single dollar in donations. That's not at all what we exist to do or our function. And so we are neutral. We don't have any skin in the game ourselves, and we are sort of I think a respected neutral party in the sector. So that's what we're trying to do with the Data Collaborative. And I think as it grows and builds, and as we have the resources to scale it further, what I would like to see happen with it is not only that we examine transactional data for giving behaviors as they relate to donations, but so many of the other things that we've touched on just in this conversation, right? How does the global network, the rapid implementation and adoption of best practices across a global network, how does that work to further generous behaviors? How many more civic how much more civic engagement can we see in other manifestations than giving as we see increased giving? So all kinds of really, really interesting questions that I think we'll have the opportunity to dig into in the coming years.
Yeah, and I think that's super exciting, being able to, and I think Giving Tuesdays really helped raise the awareness of public giving and this broader kind of philanthropy, if you like, around the world, and why people give, what drives them, and what are the impacts and the benefits of that. I think in terms of social good, democracy, all these sorts of things. I think being able to add to that conversation is going to be hugely important in the coming year. And so we're coming to the end now. I've got one last question for you before we open it up to everybody else. What does the future look like for Giving Tuesday? What are the big plans? Where's it going?
So from an organizational perspective, Giving Tuesday is going to strike out independently this year. We have been working toward that for a couple of years. It's really exciting that we're finally nearing that point. It's interesting because people often think that we're sort of just an independent startup and are surprised to hear that this idea was born at a big institution like the 92nd Street Y. So we are essentially going from being housed within a big institution to actually being a startup as we go into our 8th year. And what that will do is just allow us to really focus very, very fully on the growth of Giving Tuesday, keeping it, the same sort of open source co-created movement that it is now, but really allowing us to focus on the things that we feel like are the most important things about Giving Tuesday: the global growth, the sort of strengthening of democratic principles and social justice and civil society and civic, engagement that we touched on. The growth of our sort of work with leadership and the local community work as well, and the data work. So lots and lots that we want to accomplish, and we really want to be independent so that we can do that. So that's very exciting. And I think I think what you'll start seeing around Giving Tuesday is really just an effort to I hate to use the word, but to sort of rebrand Giving Tuesday from what people tend to misunderstand as Fundraising Tuesday to what we really see it to be, which is a global generosity movement, and which I think is ultimately a much more profound idea to people than just a day that they tend to get overwhelmed with asks from nonprofits.
Yeah, and I think that sounds super exciting. This whole global generosity movement, I think, CAF is firmly behind that idea. And we certainly look forward to working with you and your colleagues on Giving Tuesday for the years to come. Asha, it's been amazing talking to you as ever. I'm going to pass us over to back to Sarah now to moderate some questions from the listeners. Thanks,
Michael.
Much. Take care.
Thank you, both of you. This is a reminder that if you have any questions, that you can send them to us in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question verbally, also let us know, and then we can make you a panelist, and then you'll have the ability to talk directly with Asha and Michael. I have received some questions. Asha, if you don't mind, I have this question here is, what are some cultural differences between different models of Giving Tuesday? So I imagine that is how it's manifested itself between different countries. What are some interesting observations you have there?
Oh boy, I could go on and on about this question. I think one of the fascinating things about working on Giving Tuesday for me is exactly what this question gets at, which is this opportunity to see what is the same about generosity and what is different about generosity across borders, and documenting as much as possible of that. It's hard not to maintain a very intense travel schedule as Giving Tuesday, because there's really no better way to understand how it's manifesting in different countries than to go and see it there. So one activation that I find just incredibly meaningful was what happened in Liberia last year, where there was an effort to. So one of the founding ethoses about Giving Tuesday is that everybody can be a giver, right? And I think the way that manifests some places is taking a community of people who are used to being the ones in need and making them the givers, right? At least for that one day. And in Liberia, what that looked like was feeding and clothing a community of homeless people, and then having them feed and clothe others. And how kind of profoundly meaningful that was to that community and to those Giving Tuesday leaders. In Venezuela, hundreds of volunteers fanned out around Caracas, feeding people, giving people empanadas. So places where Giving Tuesday is clearly not going to manifest as a sort of huge fundraising day for NGOs, right? Where it's just not the right time for that. It actually manifests as people on the ground actually helping other people, right? Actually reaching out with their hands, with food, with shelter, and then engaging people in those acts of giving itself. So that is really remarkable to see. There's all kinds of common through lines. One of them I touched on with the sort of reticence to share about giving, which you'll see in places as diverse as South Africa and Russia and Brazil and many, many, many other places. Places where you'll often hear that places are that people are very generous in a particular region or country, but that generally means giving to sort of immediate family or people in need, small amounts of money or food. It doesn't usually mean donating. And often that's because that region has such a shady history where civil society was not always represented solely by good actors. And so trust in the sector tends to be very low, and generosity tends to take other forms. In places where trust is very high in the sector, you're going to see much more generosity manifesting as donations to nonprofits or NGOs.
Thank you for that response, Asha. Michael, I also welcome you if you have any comments, because I know CAF works globally. You're very welcome to chime in as well. I have another question from a participant. It is, for Asha, have you or the NGOs that you've worked with noticed any changes in giving outside the time of Giving Tuesday?
Oh yeah, for sure. We have a lot of data on this, and it's all really compelling. So our data, the analysis that we've done so far on the transactional data that I mentioned, first of all showed that Giving Tuesday is a net lift on giving. What I mean by that is it's not a spike in giving that then comes at the expense of other giving. And that was a speculation that came up over and over in Giving Tuesday's early years. From our vantage point, we were sure that was not what was happening, but now we are actually able to say conclusively that it's not what's happening. So Giving Tuesday functions more like a positive natural disaster, where you see this sort of spike in generosity, but then you still see, generosity over the course of the other days of the year, so not a big dip in it afterwards. We're also able recently to show that, and not just we, a lot of our platform partners have done this data analysis on their own data sets, that Giving Tuesday donors tend to be repeat givers, that they tend to give more often in the weeks and months following Giving Tuesday. Facebook did an interesting analysis on that following their first, when they first rolled out their fundraising tools year before last year. And that Giving Tuesday donors tend to be more sticky. So they tend to give over and over to the same organization, but their generosity is likely to manifest in other ways, including non-monetary ways as well. And one very interesting thing we were able to show is there's a lot of worry in the sector these days that people are doing things like giving to individuals or projects on places like GoFundMe or Kickstarter. So in other words, giving that is not going to a nonprofit is coming at the expense of giving to nonprofits. And our data just doesn't show that at all. In fact, it shows that people who give are likely to give in multiple forms. So that people who give to crowdfunding projects, for example, are still more likely to give to charities.
Great, thank you. And this might be a little bit related to the information on data, but are algorithms and social media restricting Giving Tuesday impact?
No, I don't think so. That would be kind of hard for me to say, right? Because I wouldn't know. I certainly think that they have the power to restrict giving on Giving Tuesday, but Facebook processed $125 million in donations on the last Giving Tuesday, which is really an extraordinary amount of money. And those were, the average gift size on Giving Tuesday was just over $100. So really like fairly small gifts in the grand scheme of things. $125 million of that happening on Facebook alone. So I think that if we see platforms committing to using their algorithms to further generosity, then that won't be a problem.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I've just been sent a last question, and if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to send them to the Wings office and we can ask them on your behalf. This question is, are there any great tri-sector examples of Giving Tuesday collaborations? Why do you think that these were successful and how were they accomplished?
Tri-sector, I'm assuming that means private sector, public sector, third sector?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. So the examples of those that I would mention are all of the community campaigns. The community campaigns all tend to bring together all of those sectors. They tend to bring together local government, local businesses, local nonprofits, schools, children, families, and houses of worship. So there's, I think that's where we really see it in that sort of local activation, because there's a huge incentive for all of those different sectors to be active, because they all feel the same sense of civic pride in their local community. And then aside from that, I think we see a lot of private and sort of cross-sectoral in the sense of a corporation working for a cause or a small business working for a cause with a nonprofit.
Wonderful.
And actually, I would just add to that my kind of personal favorite thing to see is actually nonprofits working together, right? So it's actually more normal I think, to see a corporation working for a cause, especially now, because all corporations are very aware that customers are looking for that kind of thing. It's far less normal than it should be to see nonprofits reaching out to each other in ways that benefit them both or more than two of them. And so that's what I really love to see is us breaking down our own barriers that we've erected between each other.
Thank you. Thank you for that reflection. We have a guest, Tumiso, that would like to be unmuted, so we're going to unmute them and they can ask a question directly to you. Tumiso, can you hear us? So maybe this might not work. We'll get in contact with them. In the meantime, Michael, do you have any closing comments, or Asha, would you like to say any closing comments? And then we can make sure to send you Tumiso's question online by email.
Great. I just want to say thank you very much for having me. It's so nice to talk to Michael again. I'm sorry I took up so much air and barely let him get a word in edgewise. And if he wants to chime in now, I'd be delighted. You know, everybody keep Giving Tuesday in mind for this coming year. And our website is givingtuesday.org. And maybe Michael could chime in with the UK website as well if anybody has any questions or wants any materials.
No, I'll just end from my side saying, as ever, it's always been great talking to you, Asha, and learning more about Giving Tuesday, especially about the future plans that you have. We're incredibly excited here in CAF in the UK, but also I know my colleagues in Russia as well are hugely excited about the work they're planning to do with you later this year, and hopefully more of our network will be able to support the movement as it continues to grow. It's hugely exciting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that this webinar will be on the YouTube channel of Wings and CAF, and we'll send it to you afterward. Thank you for joining us, Asha and Michael. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.